Hello and a very warm welcome. I'm Kit McDonald. I'm the creator of Ginkgo Ferment and the project director of Ferment TV. Per usual, before we begin, I do have some housekeeping notes. This session is being recorded so that we can share it online afterward. We welcome and encourage audience participation in the chat and Q&A boxes throughout the conversation. You can find those at the bottom of your screen. And so please don't leave your questions until the very last minute, as we'd like to allocate as much time to them as possible. And of course, please be nice to our speakers. And finally, stick around until the end, where I will return to preview next week's second to last broadcast. So for those of you who are new to Ferment TV, we're an experimental space for virtual gatherings by Ginkgo Bioworks, created in partnership with London-based agency Faber Futures. We foreground multimedia storytelling from the world of synthetic biology. You're currently tuned in to our launch series. You can visit ferment.tv to learn more about our platform and go to our YouTube channel to catch up on previous conversations. Now for today's conversation, we're focused on the theme of thriving, working together to live well together. I'm very pleased to introduce you to today's speakers, Arielle Johnson, Selassie Atadika, and Sudeep Agarwala. With Christina Agapakis as moderator, they'll be mapping connections between microbial, sensorial, and decolonial food systems. After over a decade spent engaged in humanitarian work with the United Nations and years of self-teaching in the culinary arts, Selassie Atadika completed coursework at the Culinary Institute of America. Her company, Midunu, a nomadic and private dining enterprise in Accra, Ghana, embodies new African cuisine. It celebrates culinary heritage where culture, community, and cuisine intersect with the environment, sustainability, and economy by employing local, seasonal, and underutilized ingredients, including traditional grains and proteins, to deliver Africa's bounty to the table. Chef Selassie uses chocolate as a base to feature flavors and essence of Africa. She launched the Midunu Institute, which looks to document and preserve the continent's culinary heritage. She was a finalist in the 2019 Basque Culinary World Prize. Dr. Arielle Johnson is a scientist specializing in food and flavor, especially in the context of cooking, restaurants, and food systems. She was the in-house R&D scientist for the world's best restaurant, Noma, in Copenhagen. And she's currently the science officer on Alton Brown's Food Network show, Good Eats. Arielle works on food chemistry, fermentation, drinks, fine dining, making food labs, education, flavor collaboration, and writing about all of the above. Her formal training is in analytical chemistry and sensory analysis, but she works in any kind of technique or discipline that's useful for making knowledge about food flavor and the systems they inhabit. Dr. Sudeep Agarwala is a program director at Ginkgo Bioworks, focusing on exploring and developing eukaryotic expression systems for producing recombinant protein, specifically for food production through fermentation. He specializes in yeast biology and molecular genetics as a synbio tool to develop strains and processes for fermentation. Sudeep completed his PhD at MIT, where he studied how RNA metabolism regulates yeast differentiation pathways. His interest in yeast translates into his passion for sourdough starters and challah baking. The quest for the perfect recipe resulted in a vast experimentation with alternative methods for yeast cultivation. Amidst national yeast shortages during stay-at-home orders, Sudeep shared these best practices in an op-ed for the Washington Post. And today's moderator, Dr. Christina Agapakis. She's a biologist, writer, and artist interested in microbes and the future of biotechnology. As Ginkgo Bioworks creative director, Christina collaborates with engineers, designers, artists, and social scientists to explore the many unexpected connections between microbiology, technology, art, and pop culture. And with this lengthy introduction, I am pleased to introduce Christina as our moderator. Over to you.
Thanks, Kit, and thanks all of you for joining us. I'm so excited for this conversation. I've been looking forward to it all week, and I'm going to just dive right in. So I wanted to start with a question about all of your sort of personal stories and your personal paths to where you are today. I think you've all come to food from very different backgrounds and from very different perspectives. So I guess the question to all of you is, what brings you to food, and what is your, what's that encounter with food mean for you? Somebody start, or else.
I'll go ahead.
Please, yeah.
I mean, for me, food has always been, my family immigrated to the US when I was about 6, 7 years old. So food from Ghana was kind of one of the main parts of how we held on to our heritage while living in the US. And then later on in life, when I moved back to Ghana, and with a geography kind of background, I just sort of started seeing food as something that starts from the environment, that starts from the soil, it starts from what can grow here. And then you start seeing all these ways that we process food to make sure that it's preserved. And that actually is the kind of the foundation of how I started seeing cuisine and trying to respect it in the space of sort of globalization. How do you hold on to what is from where you are from?
I'll go next. Well, so my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, was always a very fantastic cook. And we would cook together. And I, as a somewhat intense and bookish child, would often, as soon as we got to her house, start just reading her piles of cookbooks, over and over. And then when I was in undergrad, actually, I was doing a chemistry bachelor's degree. I went to NYU here in New York, where they also have a food studies program. So I got kind of interested in that, and at the time happened to luck into a professor that I worked with was also in the chemistry department, very interested in food, and he and some chefs and some people from the food studies department were starting a kind of seminar series about the intersection between cooking and science. And that really resonated with me, that you could have this cultural and creative pursuit, but study molecules and other natural phenomena. So I ended up doing research with them, doing my chemistry degree, deciding that I wanted to become a scientist to study this, but focus very much on food and cuisine. So I found a graduate program that would let me do that, and kept collaborating with chefs and tenders and other people in the food world, and ended up doing collaborations with Noma while I was still in grad school, Noma in Copenhagen, the restaurant. And then when I graduated, I moved there and started working with them full time. So that's how that happened.
That's great.
I'm kind of kicking myself for going last, because I think I'm the least impressive of everyone who's spoken so far. My interest in food is sort of the most plebeian. I grew up to Bengali immigrants in the Chicagoland area, and they always had we always had our style of food at home. And I as a kid, I always remember thinking, well, what are normal people eating for dinner? And that I didn't realize it, but that's sort of a fraught question in itself, right? And then you grow up in this cuisine, and I think, Selassie, you were talking about growing up with a cuisine at home too, from Ghanaian immigrants to the U.S. And then you go to college and you want to reproduce some of that, and at least for me, it's always calling my mom and saying, is this what it's supposed to look like? How do you cook this? And inherent, that too is a very fraught question, because I'm asking my mom a question about what food is supposed to taste like, and she's coming from a background where this food is basically what everyone's eating. So there's not necessarily a specific way that it's supposed to taste. And then I got married to this lovely Jewish gentleman from the UK, who is half Sephardic and half Ashkenazi. and you want to talk about culture and heritage and food in that context, right? Like that's an entire smorgasbord, because he comes from a family which has been wandering for generations and comes here. And then finally, I tricked Ginkgo into giving me this really exciting position, and it was revealed to me that, well, we can actually divorce ourselves from our existing food chains, and we can take the animals out of our food chain. And now we're in this position where we don't have to have animals as part of our food chain, and that's I can't quite tell if that's a really exciting time or a really terrifying time, or maybe it's both. And I'd love to unpack that a bit more. And just as all that was getting going, COVID hits, and all of Twitter falls in love with sourdough, and that's that's where I'm a Viking. That's sort of what allowed me to engage with a lot of people on these really interesting questions about food, and very, very pleased to be here, and really thank you for inviting me to this conversation.
Let's see, where's the best way to go next? I guess I'm interested. So yeah, we talked a little bit about sort of all of your upbringing and your sort of journeys with food and your kind of cultural connections to it and through your own families. I guess I have a question, which I think might animate more of our conversation later, of what is food, and at what level do you engage with food, at what sort of aspect of this kind of multifaceted cultural and chemical thing are you typically working and interacting? I guess there are probably many ways at once. So yeah, what is food?
Well, I don't know if I can define what is food, but I can tell you the lens that I generally approach it with. My PhD research, which has informed a lot of the way that I continue to work, focused on flavor chemistry. So the molecules that make flavor, which is mostly taste and smell, actually mostly smell, and the sensations that those create. So I spent a lot of time essentially counting molecules and getting human panelists to taste things in very precise ways and tell me what they were sensing, and then using multivariate statistics to relate them. But in the course of doing that, it was a chemistry program, but one would naturally think about, okay, so we have these molecules in these foods, where do those molecules come from? If they're in wine, they come from the grapes and from fermentation. So okay, so why are yeasts and Vitis vinifera creating those molecules in the first place, and what functional role might they play, and where do they come from? Some are related to, in fruit, attraction, some are related to defense. But then on the other side of the equation, it's okay, well, so why can we humans sense these things in the first place? And why do we have 400 or so active olfactory receptor genes? Why is that the largest family of genes in our genome? Why do we process smell specifically through our emotional and memory centers before we perceive it actively or consciously, unlike the other senses? And it became sort of clear to me that flavor is this very personal sensory phenomenon, but it also is a direct connector to landscapes and ecology, because that affects how organisms do their biochemistry. It's related to human evolution. There's selection pressures that caused us to be able to preserve the sensory, or develop and preserve the sensory system in the first place. And flavor can really be very closely connected to the personal experience of color. If you form and access memories and emotions every time you taste something, then of course food experiences are going to be closely held emotional and connecting experiences. So so from just counting molecules to thinking about all the acts of I guess, life on Earth that flavor attaches to, is how I generally look at food.
Yeah, I hope it's okay if I found that really compelling, because like I mean
Well, of course that's okay. Thank you.
No, I find it really compelling because like one of the things that I think about in terms of food is what will people eat and what will people not eat, right? On all sorts of levels, like what do we consider food and what do we not consider food? Because growing up, we were a tea drinking household, right? Like it is an Indian household. We drank tea. We did not drink coffee. And like, my dad would have the occasional cup of coffee. My mom doesn't really like the taste. But like that's sort of like tied to identity and our sense of what it means to be Indian. But then you grow up and you go to college and you realize that these tea estates in Darjeeling, in Assam, and Ceylon are roughly 200 years old. And the definition of what that culture is, and like your understanding of what flavor is really culturally determined, and like and is rooted in topics that I'm not familiar with or able to talk about in some ways, until I get to a place like Ginkgo, where we say that there are these compounds and there are these molecules very similar to what you were talking about, Arielle, that evoke these sensations and that are core to people's sense of identity, right? Like the meatiness of meat, or the aromas of different flavors and flowers that are going extinct, which are so core to what we understand as comfort, and what we understand as appetizing, and what we understand as food, right? And that this sort of esoteric understanding I had about DNA and RNA and like regulatory mechanisms is key to being able to preserve that and being able to propagate that in a way that I personally found really exciting and unexpected.
And I think maybe picking up on both of the conversations, for me, the lens that I use kind of has to do with flavor and how flavor is sort of developed, and looking at a lot of the cultural and environmental situations that I see in Ghana. I'm finding that a lot of the preservation techniques to preserve food from spoiling, because we live in a space where we live in the danger zone. If you're like a chef or a cook and you know that food can't be at a certain temperature, that's actually where we live all day, every day. So when I started looking around, I started seeing the smoking and the drying of different ingredients, the fermentation of certain ingredients, to allow them to be able to be preserved. So we wouldn't lose harvest, but that's actually the foundation of a lot of the flavors that you find in our cuisine in Ghana. And they're very bold and they're bright, and that's kind of what I started playing with and trying to understand, and how we link that. And as you said, we take these flavors and they become memories. And so being able to take a flavor and offer it to somebody is bringing them back somewhere. So I recently, I had been talking to a friend of mine and found out that there's traditional way of smoking water in Ghana. Mm-hmm. And what we do is we take the there's a part of the palm tree, the oil palm tree has a sort of a few little pieces that come off the tree. We burn them, and as you're burning them, you turn a ceramic pot over, and the pot takes in all the smoke into its crevices. Then water is poured over it. And as you know, like ceramics also have a way of keeping water cool. And then water is then offered because, it's quite warm. So whenever someone would come to the house, you're actually offering them this glass of water. And I did it. And that's actually how we start off our dining experience, because it's such a traditional way of receiving people. I did it for a friend of mine, and she just tasted it. And the only thing she said is, "My grandmother." Oh. And it was amazing to me, because it was one of the first times I'd actually done it for somebody else. And I'd been part of our tasting menu, but I hadn't started. And it was the first time I'd done it. And that was exactly what she said. And it was interesting because that same glass of water for someone visiting Ghana would be a brand new experience that would be different, and having smoky umami in water. And at the same time, someone who is from Ghana, where it's taking them back to a whole an old place rather than a new sensation, a new place. So that's for me, food kind of bringing people together and getting a chance to understand the journeys that brings food to our table.
That's really beautiful. I wanted to ask you all kind of a question now of, like kind of bring it to the present day and sort of like our Zoom existence here and like what's happening with COVID, like the whole, that's what sort of sparked our desire to want to have these conversations, right? Like what are, here we are in Zoom world, and like here we are experiencing all of these things and kind of struggling to connect and bridge a lot of different kinds of experiences, and food certainly cuts across a lot of those kinds of things. So I guess I wanted to hear about, your kinds of like thoughts and experiences and, what's been going on for you during this time of the pandemic. Maybe Selassie, for you, I'm curious, like your background, you were, a humanitarian like responder with the UN, right? And your so much of your kind of career has been in this world of sort of humanitarian crisis response. So I'm curious for you, like, especially like what's, how have you been looking at the pandemic? Where does food meet that kind of moment of crisis for you in your experience?
I think like everybody else, it's a whole new experience, even though I have sort of the background of doing this work. I think the last response that I did before sort of going full time with food was the Ebola response, which is in some ways similar, but in some ways so completely different. But I think for me, I understood that it was not going to be a short-term thing. I think that from a, like everybody else perspective, you kind of hunker down. So one thing that was very interesting in Ghana was that everyone started going into sort of, saving, like just stockpiling stuff. And the interesting thing is in Ghana, we actually have a culture already of using a lot of food that doesn't go off. So it was really weird because everyone kind of went back to their boarding school days and was like, okay, we're getting our tin sardines, we're getting, we have gari, we have, there's a preserved chili sauce that's made here locally. So everybody kind of knew what they were gonna buy. So there was that aspect, but then the second aspect for me was kind of, I've spent a lot of time in my garden. I had one that I had been doing off and on, but I actually just invested a lot of time. And the last week, it's amazing what's happening in my garden right now. So for me, it's been about how do I take this information and share this knowledge with other people, because whether it's a balcony or it's you have space in the back of your house, I'm spending more time cooking myself. I notoriously didn't have much food in my fridge because as a chef, you're just kind of always on the move or eating out of your, kitchen, but not really at home. And so now I'm cooking for myself on a very regular basis and trying to think, how do I make this easier for people at home? It's kind of, how do you simplify your life? And a lot of that has been kind of what I've been thinking through. But I think in terms of the pandemic and sort of the longer term trajectory, for example, in Africa, we're going to have a different end date. If there is the vaccine coming through, ours is not going to be at the same time. There's going to be a lot of challenges because I don't know if you guys heard, but when the conversations around the vaccines was coming through, it was like, oh, let's test the vaccine. Let's send it to Africa. So like right now, nobody in Africa wants to hear anything about a vaccine, and it's actually having a negative impact on normal, regular vaccines like polio, measles, et cetera, because of this idea of where is it coming from. So there's gonna need to be a lot of confidence building as we look towards, next year and how to move out of it. So yeah, those are just kind of like my brief thoughts on that.
I hadn't heard the information about vaccines being tested.
Yeah, it came out of France and everyone was like, oh, okay. I see how we're going to work together on this. That's
really heartbreaking.
Onto a lighter topic.
No, it's not. I mean, I guess like part of to get back to my experience with COVID, up until recently, I've been sort of working on diagnostics for testing. So not the vaccine end of things, but actually figuring out ways to roll out testing to much broader group of people. That's been exciting, but like I'd be lying that there isn't sort of like the second life that I'm leading of like sort of introducing people. I think maybe introducing people to like sort of fermentation as technology, right? Like, and what sort of crystallized for me during COVID is that there's a cultural aspect to food and there's a technological aspect to food, and that we can think of microbes, and for me, yeast as a type of technology in two senses, right? From in my day job at Ginkgo, sort of like developing yeasts to have these different types of flavors and produce these replacements, but also like watching people discover that there's yeast around them that they can harness and use for their own bread, and that sort of leads into the cultural part of it, because growing up growing up, I was brought up on fermented lentils and fermented grains, and yeah, we'd have the occasional loaf of bread, of course. But when you talked about fermentation, and when you talked about the main staple, it was rice or lentils or different types of pulses, and the way that you manipulate those by letting them sit out at certain temperatures, or letting them dry, or processing them in certain ways was sort of the core of what we were talking about. But that's also the cultural part of the food. The technology and the way to harness this technology and make sure it's safe is always the same, right? Like find a source that has this yeast on it or these microbes in it, control it in a certain way, give it the food that it wants, add salt to sort of retard the other not beneficial organisms in there, right? And allow the things that you want to flourish. And that's sort of a core technology that I think, at least during the sourdough craze of March 2020, people really picked up on and started discovering for themselves.
Yeah, I mean, something I noticed, or like not just noticed, got very involved in starting about probably almost 10 years ago at this point, was that like chefs and cooks that were interested in like experimental cuisine, but not really like molecular gastronomy, more like working smartly with more natural materials, I guess. We're all talking about that on social media. It was Twitter at that time. It's mostly moved to Instagram over the last several years. But whereas in previous times, if you wanted to like find out what a very cool or like a very innovative restaurant was doing, you had to either like fly and eat there or attend a conference like Madrid Fusion or something like that to see what Ferran Adrià, the head chef of LBE, was doing. Now these cooks, often like sometimes head chefs, often like sous chefs of R&D, were just sharing this information freely online with each other. Whether it was different stuff about wild edible plants or like lots of fermentation techniques. Yeah, that's something that had been kind of bubbling under the surface, but now now anyone can participate in that. And I think I've seen a lot more like on people I know, but also sort of around accessing this information that's sort of publicly available if you know where to look, and then using it to experiment on the ingredients that they have around them. So I think with a lot of people, not everyone, stuck inside, that's definitely, or stuck at home, that's been a fun evolution of like knowledge sharing that we've seen.
Am I allowed to ask a question? Is that sorry?
Sure.
That's my job.
No,
because I think I know how I'd answer this question, but I'm actually really curious for Arielle and Selassie who are sort of like working with restaurants and working like what for the home cook as well as for the chef, like what do you see as food innovation now? Like what is innovative? either during COVID or like what is sort of, what do you see as being the new innovations, and what makes food exciting for you guys? And I surprise question, sorry.
For me, a lot of it, my like inquiries are into just new flavors. For me, traveling within the continent has just taught me so much about what I don't know. And for me, there's plants and things that I mean, in my chocolates, there's one ingredient that I use and it doesn't have an English name, you know, and it's, it just blows people away and they're like, wait, what? And I'm like, yeah, like it doesn't have an English name, and it freaks people out. But for me, that's really what it is. There's just a lot we don't know that exists that everyone's been dealing with, and also just techniques, again, that cultures and people have been using for a long time that, again, has not seen the light of day. So that's where I kind of have a lot of fun. Yeah, I mean, I'm amazed by how little I know. So, yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, this is not directly related to COVID, but it definitely ties in. Something that's been really exciting to me is that a lot of this sort of inquiry and self-education and seeking knowledge to do new things or explore culture and history more deeply is really no longer just the province of like 2 Michelin-starred fine dining restaurants. I mean, there's a kind of like spreading out of like, that these ideas were possible. A lot of cooks have like worked or staged at these, but then like don't want to keep doing fine dining, or want to do fine dining in like a different way. So there could be just as much exploration of ingredients or flavors or techniques at like a like informal pop-up restaurant or a permanent but not $200 a plate place as excuse me, as at a temple of gastronomy. So and like there's a lot of the like chefs I'm really interested in and excited don't really have permanent restaurants either. They do like catering and pop-ups, or have chef training, but work in food in other ways. So that's exciting to me.
And I think it's awesome because there's a lot of people whose voices can't be heard for all the different structural reasons that now can actually be able to speak and showcase what they can do, and something that's new and different that people haven't seen and heard from before. Yeah,
I mean, there's so many like media channels that don't involve gatekeeping that have allowed people to connect and like disseminate what they're doing. That's really exciting.
I find that really fascinating because like one of the things that I, from a food technology perspective and what I think about in terms of innovation, it's a lot of molecular biology and a lot of like developing strains that can take animals out of the food chain. Christina, by the way, I don't mean to have hijacked this conversation. I think this is absolutely fascinating.
I do have more questions though. But keep going.
I'll go quick. I'll be quick. But part of what I think about in terms of biotechnology and synthetic biology is like, who are we having these conversations with, right? So you may have heard of Beyond Burger or Impossible Foods, which has basically told people, don't eat meat, try this, right? And I think that's a really powerful thing to say to Americans. But I wonder, like, part of what I'm asking, what I'm curious about in terms of what you think about it is innovation, is like, when we're talking about innovation, it's oftentimes a new dialogue that we're having with the consumer, the literal consumers of this information that we're producing. And part of what I'm always curious about is, as a scientist and as a synthetic biologist, who exactly am I developing this product for? What are the economics of that? and who am I in conversation with in producing this strain? It's just really interesting to hear what other people have to say about this.
Actually, that's a good point for like to where I want to jump in and ask another question. I think a lot of you are bringing in, or a lot of you are talking about, when you're talking about food and history and future, you're also talking about questions of power, of economics, of colonialism, of globalization, and so I guess I'm interested to ask or hear from you on your perspectives of sort of what is where does food meet power, and how might that be changing, or how should that be changing? There's a lot of questions coming from the audience, which are great, about a lot about questions of climate change, which is also kind of tied up and linked with these questions of power and economics, and how we do things, and who we're speaking to and for, right? So I guess I'm curious to hear. Yeah, I don't have a particularly crisp question, but what do you think?
If it's okay, I'm going to go first because I'm the least equipped to answer this question. But everyone, watch me try. Part of what and this sort of goes back to Selassie's earlier question about or earlier comment about vaccines being sort of like tested in the continent of Africa, right? Part of what I think about is this question of power and the story of golden rice. So I believe it is from marigolds. You can take from a gene from marigolds and put it into rice, and it has a boost of, I believe it is vitamin A, and I'm sure someone in the audience will be able to correct me. But you have a boost of vitamin A, which greatly reduces the infant mortality, especially in undernourished communities. And I believe the strain of rice was developed in Europe. I believe it was in the 90s, but because of EU regulations, was not allowed to be widespread and used widespread because of these GMO regulations. And I think that's always trotted out as a failure of Europe, of Western Europe, in sort of quashing innovation and having something which would save lives. And I guess part of being in the middle of things now, and this question of like, who is this conversation happening with, right? I guess part of the conversation that always gets left out with the story of golden rice is, were people who this rice was going to be served to, or was being brought as a solution to, who was there a real conversation that happened there? And was that either for the positive or for the negative, or was it just like, oh well, these are poor people, they'll be happy to take whatever we give them, right? And that's, I don't know, that part I'm sure it may have happened, but that's the question that always haunts me as I'm sitting in lab coming up with these solutions.
I mean, I think for me, someone recently was asking me about sort of what is my perspective on food that has fortified foods, right? So, I think that there's a portion of the population that needs fortified foods because they don't have access to a well-rounded diet, and they cannot afford a well-rounded diet. But then at the same time, we also, at a certain part of the population, who have access and can get access, should be eating better rather than just sort of, I don't know. I feel that, there's a need for diversity in our diets. There's a need for us to when we do have the opportunity to be able to do that. Interestingly, one of my turning points for kind of the work that I was doing was that to treat malnutrition, you need something called plumpy nut, which is a fortified, basically peanut butter, but it's fortified to become a medical product. It's actually medicine. And you need, I think, like 1 carton, which is 1 sachet a day for a child, to treat them from malnutrition and from severe acute malnutrition. And if not, they will die. And so in some of the work that I was doing before, I remember being in northern Nigeria, and actually the challenge there was that the therapeutic treatment was coming from France because they had the patent. So it was being produced in France and then shipped by sea to Lagos port. And then from there, it would eventually, after it was cleared, find its way up to the northern part of the country where I was, but we were getting stockouts. And I remember just standing there and I'm like, the peanuts are not from France. I'm thinking the peanuts are growing in northern Nigeria. And I'm asking myself, like, why is this child not being able to, so it's not really as simple as, oh, it was an El Nino year, so that we didn't have a lot of rain, or there's also a lot of cultural issues and there's a lot of beliefs and things that we need to kind of go through to unpack. And so for me, that was one of the reasons why I was like, we just need to focus on food. Like, I need to focus on food, and think through all these things. And so for me, when I'm now back in Ghana, I've had conversations about food that range from my friend, who's an amazing architect, and she and I had these conversations about the fact that we in modern kitchens are stuck with whatever's left over from the West. So our cuisine and our diet in an apartment or in an urban area in Accra is dictated by whoever created that equipment. Like, so you'll see that a lot of the traditional pounding and other processes that we go through don't exist in that, like the fermentation, like it doesn't exist there. So all of a sudden you're living in an apartment, and so your choice for what you're having for dinner is going to be dictated by what equipment can fit into that kitchen. You've got governments that are sending us food aid, but it's predicated on certain things. There are also governments that are or companies that are flooding our markets with like fertilizers, GMO seeds. So they're deciding what's going to be put into the government plan. You've got Europe and other places where we're off takers of everything. So like, for example, the chicken that's been in freezers for 5 years in the EU kind of gets sent to places like here. And all of a sudden the price is cheaper. So the local farmer that is actually a poultry farmer cannot compete. So all of these things in my situation are, it goes across from economics to, trade, to architecture, to design, to all of those things. And on top of all the other psychological sort of conversations around, oh, this is supposed to be better for you. So in Ghana, people are like, oh, I'm going to have a salad. It's healthy. And you're like, well, salad is healthy. Yeah. But also local traditional ingredients and foods are healthy. And there's the conversation about ratio and portions and what's on your plate. So those are some of the conversations I see in terms of who's controlling what we eat. And a lot of it is just a lot of people outside, and we don't actually know. There's just a lot of different forces playing into it.
It seems, yeah, so Sudeep, I really appreciate what you're saying about, like this idea of sort of solutions, right? And I think it intersects with a lot of things that you're saying, Selassie, like, where are these solutions coming from, right? Like, and how are they like being defined as solutions, and who is like, who is benefiting from the system that enables that to happen, or in the way that it does, right? And so I guess a last question that I have that I hope to be able to weave in some of the questions from the chat, which are also interesting, and I don't think we're going to be able to answer all of them. But I guess, the context, the title of this conversation is Food Futures, right? So I think we've been talking a lot about sort of traditional practices or contemporary experiences, but also like this question of kind of innovation and future. And often like all of these things are put as binaries, right? So they're like, there's fast food, there's slow food, there's sort of like organic and artisanal, there's industrial and GMO, right? And there's questions now here too in the chat about like freshness versus preserved foods, and questions about sort of things from the land versus things from the lab, and this kind of like either or. There's also like healthy and not healthy, and then there's like nourished and not, right? Like, and all these kind of questions that are much more complicated often than just that either or. So I guess maybe the question is sort of like, what is the way that you're sort of charting a path through these either ors, and what do you hope to see in the future, like given how these things are so interwoven and complex, like so for one of the questions, like how should or how are synthetic biology companies thinking about problems and solutions when it comes to questions of food, and how should we be thinking about that, or and maybe that's one of them, but there's many other kinds of intersections there, and ways through to that future. So maybe like that's a last question for all of you before we have to end.
I'm just gonna. We had a colleague at Ginkgo, Corey Klein, and whenever he'd see me sort of like making questionable diet choices in the kitchen because I was stress eating, and I'd always complain to him like, yeah, this is why I'm not like, this is why I weigh this much. He'd always say, well, there are no healthy or unhealthy foods, only healthy and unhealthy diets. And I think that's sort of, he was obviously joking with me. I think he actually probably believed it, and I think I believe that too. But that's also at the core of what I think, Christina, you just brought up, right? Like, I would love it if we could get rid of these terms vegan, vegetarian, healthy, unhealthy, as sort of labels and moral judgments on what you're eating, right? And rather than like saying like giving yourself a pat on the back of I ate healthy today, or I ate vegan today, or I was vegetarian today, actually thinking a bit deeper about like what is this food that I'm consuming, right? And like did the food that I had today, like what's its history, where's it coming from, how is it prepared, right? And how does that sort of speak to me, right? And I think like by rewiring yourself to think like that, you're forcing yourself to ask about what culture you belong to, about the future of the food that you're going to be eating, right? Like, is this a sustainable food? And what does sustainable food look like? There's a lot of questions about climate change, but what does sustainable food look like in a world which seems to be changing quite rapidly? And rather than saying like, eat vegan and you'll solve the world, right? And you'll be healthier, right? Like that doesn't ring true to me as much as eat, be thoughtful about what you're consuming.
I guess there's also like maybe like the higher order question, right? Is like, can we escape the idea that it is like on us as independent consumers to make these choices too? Like, and like, we want, the conversation about systems. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, and if we're not talking about systems, how much of our individual choice as a consumer is actually a choice, or how much is the illusion of choice? Just going right in there.
Are you sure we don't have another hour?
Yeah, right. I mean, slightly off topic from that, not to talk over anyone who wanted to address that further, but going back to your question of like binaries, I mean, just like me personally, my own perhaps not like global level struggle was like, I mean, I have this formal training in the sciences, and like there's just a lot of science is an objective process, but it's determined by the values of the people that do it. But I think a lot of scientists don't like to think about that because they just feel like what they do is objective, whether that's like, more like analytical basic sciences or more like technological development things. I mean, so when I was, coming up in my training, I used to like think and ask a lot about like, okay, well, like, why are these the questions that we're asking? Like, why is this? Why does everyone feel like this is important? Why does this get funding? And then, kind of getting like deeper into like restaurant work, where a lot of chefs were co-opting tools from the sciences and technology, but using them to their own creative ends. I don't know, maybe start thinking more in terms of like dialectics, so that like the options are not so much like either we have this thing that we define as futuristic, and it is very, you know, defined by like modernity and, you know, industrial technology, capitalism, and centralization, and, you know, the ultimate, you know, quote unquote triumph of empirical knowledge over matisse or embodied or traditional knowledge, or, you know, you have something backwards, quote unquote backwards, and from the past. And if you don't do what we're defining as futuristic, then you have to look backwards. But there's, I mean, all kinds of examples of people taking some of the tools of this more like quote unquote modern approach or empirical or scientific approach to food, and then combining it with a, you know, an attitude of like localism or regionalism over, you know, globalism or standardization, or looking at their own histories, their own landscapes, their own interest in flavor and complexity over standardization, and then by combining the two, creating a synthesis to the thesis and antithesis, getting into some, you know, Hegel or Marx there, but I mean, that to me is what's really exciting, and gives me some hope for the future. I mean, I don't know what we're going to do to like save cuisines and ingredients in the face of climate change, but I think it's going to come out of that sort of more dialectical rather than binary approach.
Selassie, do you have anything you want to?
No, I mean, I fully agree. I mean, we have something in Ghana. It's one of the Adinkra symbols, and it's when you look at it, it's actually like a chicken that's facing forward, like the feet are facing front, and the neck turns around behind it, and it's picking up a golden egg. And it's basically symbolizes go back and get it. So you have to be forward facing, but you also need to make sure you understand what has happened before and why you have what is there. So I think it's really, it has to be a combination of everything. I think, you know, when you look at it as one or the other, you actually are losing a lot of the elements. And again, like, we have to make sure people are happy with what they eat, they enjoy it. You know, we have all these memories around food. How do we combine that to make sure that, you know, whatever you're presenting someone with will actually be appreciated? So I think it's really, you know, we can't just come up with a solution that's like, okay, this is going to feed more people. You know, that's Green Revolution. What happened there? But we need to kind of come up with something that allows us to really have a conversation. But it needs to be a patchwork, because I think it's not one or the other.
Yeah, I can't imagine living in this hellscape where everyone's just like downing Soylent to stay alive, and like
it's gotta taste good.
Nothing against Soylent, but like having like food not evoking this world of memory and like imagination of where you come from and who you are.
Well, and I think like you can. I don't know if you should need to, but you can even make an argument that for like whole foods with flavors, in something like a tomato, one of the flavor notes that is particularly nice comes from a class of molecules called morasoprenoids. They're also in like roses and apples and quinces. It gives it this sort of like complex, slightly like floral, fruity note to it. Well, we're particularly sensitive to those norisoprennoids that are derived from provitamin A carotenoids. So like vitamin A, it's this big long 40 carbon compound. It breaks down enzymatically to make different types of norisoprennoids. The carotenoids that we can use for vitamin A make flavor compounds that we're more sensitive to. So I mean, not only is there like an enjoyment and getting people to accept things aspect to flavor, but this kind of possible hidden message about nutrition and you know, getting a biochemically useful diet that I think is important to take into account, rather than just thinking about flavor as something to just be added to things.
Well, I wish we could keep talking for another hour. But we're all out of time. Thank you for a really beautiful and inspiring conversation to all of you. I encourage everybody who joined us to keep reading, to reach out, to keep the conversation going in any way we can. And I'm going to hand it back to Kit to tell us about next week's episode.
But before I tell you about next week's episode, I again like to reiterate our thanks to our speakers today, Selassie, Arielle, and Sudeep, and of course, Christina for moderating today. I'd also like to thank the Faber Futures team, Natsai Chiesa, Laura Vent, Joanna Mann, Camille Theory, and Magda Olmoko, and everyone again in the audience. Thank you. Now for next week, in our penultimate episode of this launch series, and in the spirit of online communities, we want to try something a little different. In recognition of the valuable contribution our audience you have made for this series, and the diverse perspectives that you represent, we want to open the floor to the Ferment TV audience. This broadcast is an opportunity for you to air your thoughts and to question the world of synthetic biology and the role that it plays in our society, as well as to respond to the topics that we've covered alongside our fantastic speakers throughout the series. So, hosted by yours truly, this episode will feature our fearless moderators, Christina and Natsai, who will bring together their expertise and knowledge with your thoughts and questions. So, with that, please visit ferment.tv to sign up for that, and our newsletter, which will keep you posted on our final episode. And don't forget that you can also revisit past conversations on Ferment TV's YouTube channel. And of course, tune in on things like Instagram. So with that, thank you so much, and we'll see you next week.